Independence Day. This Saturday, we celebrate the birth of our nation. History lesson. July 4th, 1776 was the day that the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. The American colonists had finally had enough of the taxation, of the oppression from Britain, and finally made the decision, hey, we are going to go out and we're going to be independent from them. And if you think about it, this idea of independence is ingrained in every single thing that we do in this country. That's even a part of being a student, right? You're learning to become fully independent. Most of you aren't there yet, but that's the goal. And that's a good thing, just as long as we really understand what that actually means. Think about it. If you win a major prize, I'm talking like an Oscar, and you've been deemed the best actor or the best actress, and you go on stage and they ask you, they say, hey, give us a speech, and you stand there and you stand up there and you look them dead in the eyes and you say, man, I'd like to thank myself because I did it all on my own. They'd say, man, you're Looney Tunes, you're crazy. Or maybe you're making a hilarious joke because there's absolutely no way that you have done all of this by yourself. On a day that we celebrate our independence, I want us to remember how we are meant to live in dependence. See, the Israelites really struggled with this concept. They're enslaved in Egypt. So we're talking back in Exodus, right? And God takes this man named Moses in Exodus 7 through 10, and he uses him to give 10 wildly inconvenient signs. I mean, we're talking plagues here that force the Pharaoh to let them go, to release the Israelites from captivity. And so let's pause for a second. The Israelites were in full dependence of God. They had no hope of escape from captivity unless God did something in their stead. And God does. Now let's see how long it takes the Israelites to forget that they need to depend on God. Chapter 14. Exodus 14 is where they wish they could do things on their own again. You see, God leads them to the edge of the Red Sea and in the desert, and suddenly they look up and they realize that the Egyptians, they've changed their mind. And they're coming back after them, chasing them, trying to take them back into captivity or worse. And here's what they say in verse 11. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone? Let us serve the Egyptians. It would be better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." Boom. Miracles are cast aside. The largeness of God is cast out of their mind. The plagues and the signs, those don't matter anymore. See, they're terrified. And because of that, they start wishing and planning based on themselves. They were once fully dependent on God, but now they wanted to do things their way. They would rather be independent and enslaved than dependent and saved. I can relate to this. When things are scary, when we are afraid, it's easier to trust in yourself than in God. It's easier to take control of the things that you can control and to depend upon yourself. Let me give you an example. When I was in college, I was a lifeguard at the local YMCA. And there's a lot of ongoing training that goes on in that role. And part of the training talks about what to do when you're approaching a distressed swimmer. So this is someone that is drowning but trying to stay afloat. So they're panicked, they're thrashing around a little bit, they're trying to do anything they can to keep their head above water. And now imagine that you're the lifeguard swimming up to them. And you swim up to the front of that person, which is actually something that you're trained not to do. What happens the instant that you come within arm's reach? They grab at you, they cling to you, they start climbing up, trying to get their head as high above the water as possible. And even though you are there to help them, they are so panicked that they are fully independent. Every man for himself. They're going to grab at you and pull at you until both of you drown. And the irony is that you are there to save them. And if they were able to follow your instructions and depend on you, you'd both be fine. It doesn't seem as extreme as this, but we do this all the time. Maybe you're in a relationship with your parents that just isn't going well. So you, in your independence, stop trying because it's easier than being dependent and maybe even intentionally praying for your mom or your dad in that time. The Israelites are struggle busing. Like, they are riding the struggle bus and they are not happy. But Moses, he relies on God, and God parts the sea, right? We remember this story. They walk through dry land, and then the sea sweeps over the Egyptians. God closes the sea upon them, and they again are saved. And you'd think that this would be enough, that their need to depend on God was proven, but it wasn't so. In Exodus 19, Moses goes up to Mount Sinai, right, where he goes and he speaks with God and he gains the 10 commandments along with other instruction, and he spends the next 13 chapters on the mountain. In Exodus 32, when the people saw that Moses, is what it says, when people saw that Moses was a long way in coming down from the mountain, it's going to be a while, they gathered around Aaron and said, "Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." And this is a big one for us. We like to be independent, so independent that we set up things in our own timing. When Moses and his God took longer than the Israelites wanted, they set out to make a new God. First off, can you believe that? So the God that frees you with plagues and parts the sea is no longer enough anymore. He's taken too long. And so we are going to go ahead and we're going to create a new God. It's a bold move, Cotton. I have a buddy back home in Florida who wants to go into ministry. He's one of those guys that naturally has so much influence over people. Yeah, everyone wants to be his friend. Everyone wants to follow him. And when he goes into ministry, he's going to do, I'm confident, he's going to make a huge impact for the kingdom. And if he had it his way, he would start ministry right now. But there are still some major parts of his spiritual life that Jesus is still working on. Jesus is still preparing him on for the work that is set before him. And truthfully, if he were to be hired right now, there's a decent chance that he would be fired fairly quickly, because of sin that's in his life that Jesus is still working out. See, God's timing is perfect, and we can depend on him for that. But again, the Israelites, they decide that they know better. And so the Israelites depend on themselves and not God because of fear and because they don't like God's timing, and surely they will get it right this time. In Numbers 13, God tells Moses to send out 12 spies. These men are to be sent out into the promised land. They're right on the edge of this land that they've been pursuing, right? And they're to be sent out and give account on what they see. These men, they go out and they return. Now remember, this is the land that God promised. He has taken them out of Egypt. He's parted the seas, right? Given them commandments and brought them to the edge of this land, something that would have been absolutely impossible without God. And these men, these spies, they go into the land and they come back with this report. In Numbers 13, verse 26. They gave Moses this account: "We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and with honey. And here's some of its fruit. But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large." Yeah, this land is great, but they're going to destroy us if we try to take it. Hey, let's not get crazy here. Let's not try to conquer these people. Let's turn back. Hey, don't be a fool. They're more powerful than us. And although Caleb and Joshua were ready to depend on God, the rest of these spies, the other 10, they had decided that this task was simply too big to overcome. And maybe that's where you are. wishing God would show up, but convinced that the task is simply too large. When our daughter Lila was a newborn, we had a couple of fears. My wife has a condition called congenital glaucoma, which affects her vision and is degenerative. And she's had it since she was a newborn. And a huge fear of ours was that Lila would have glaucoma as well. In her first few months, she started having all these symptoms. All signs pointed to her having this disease, and we were scared. We talked to doctors, we talked to friends, we were terrified. And it felt like this insurmountable giant. It would have been easy to respond in the same ways as the Israelites and just accept that this wasn't a battle that could be won, to run away, but instead, Jenny and I, we prayed. And we prayed boldly. We stopped even asking for healing, and we started thanking God for the healing that we believed He would give our daughter. Y'all, glaucoma isn't something that gets cured. It's not a disease that goes away, but my daughter doesn't have it. And I'm convinced that she did. God heard our prayers as we were dependent upon Him, as we faced giants that we couldn't take down. He fought for us. However, the Israelites chose not to depend on God. They were afraid of giants. They thought them too big to be overcome. And so God, He exiled them for 40 years to wander the wilderness. And that sounds harsh. Man, that's crazy. 40 years from now, think about it. You're going to be close to the age that your grandparents are. And that's a long time, right? They old, right? Why would God ask them to wander that long? And I think that God intended on teaching one of the most important lessons of all time, a lesson that would take 40 years to teach. God was going to spend the next 40 years teaching the Israelites that they should depend on Him. You see, during this time, they would be wandering the desert, and there wouldn't be food regularly available. God, being all-knowing, He knew this, and He had a plan. See, each morning there would be manna, bread from heaven, upon the ground. And manna was God's answer to the hunger problem. The hunger of His people would be solved by this manna. But here's the fun part. They were instructed to only gather what they needed for that day, and if they gathered more, it would spoil. So each morning, they ate food from God and had to trust that the next morning, more would show up. In their independence, God had found a way to teach them to live in dependence of Him. And here's the piece that we need to understand. Everything that God does is for His glory. It's for His name's sake. And like the Israelites, we are able to choose if we are going to depend on God or on ourselves. And the catch is that God plans to teach us the correct answer no matter our choice. He plans to teach us that in our fear we can depend on Him, that we can trust in His timing, that there is nothing too big. Because here is the truth. It is better to be dependent upon God than independent alone. Would you guys pray with me? Jesus, we love You so much, but I know that words are not enough, that we need to live this out in our daily, that we need to rely on You in all things. And Lord, if we are honest, there are things that are really scary to give over to You, because sometimes they feel more real than You do. And God, I pray that You show up in big ways. I pray that You embrace us in Your arms, that You hold us close, that we can know that You are there and that You are trustworthy and that You are good and You have our best interests at heart. God, we know that this is for Your glory. And so we're going to give over those things that we cling on to right now. We're going to push them over to You because we don't need them more than we need You. God, help us to live independence of You. Amen. Now, after this message, I have some questions that I want you to discuss as a family. What is it that you are struggling to depend on Jesus with? Is it a relationship? Is it bringing a secret sin into light? Is it offering forgiveness even though you still feel wronged? And why is it so hard to trust God in that situation? All right, guys, thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week.